The cold morning air over southern England carried a low hum, a mechanical heartbeat that stretched for miles. Dozens of tanks rolled across narrow country roads, engines roaring, treads grinding the frost beneath them. This was not a battlefield, but it looked like one. British Cromwells, Centaurs, and American Shermans moved in long, disciplined columns through the mist, bound for what was meant to be a grand test of endurance. No bullets, no enemy, just 2,000 miles of relentless marching, an experiment that would decide which army truly understood how to build a machine that could win a war. The officers called it Exercise Dracula, a name chosen with grim humor. On paper, it was simple. Drive the tanks across England to measure reliability, speed, and durability under real conditions. In practice, it would drain confidence from Britain's armoured program faster than any combat defeat could. What began as a technical trial would quietly become one of the most humiliating engineering lessons in British history. To the soldiers inside the Cromwells, it didn't feel like a grand experiment. It felt like exhaustion. Long days on the move, the stench of gasoline and oil clinging to every breath, constant mechanical noise echoing in their heads. The Sherman crews, on the other hand, kept rolling effortlessly. They stopped only when ordered, their engines idling smoothly, mechanics with little to do but check oil and tighten bolts. Every mile widened the invisible gap between American practicality and British ambition. From a distance, the contrast was subtle. The Cromwell was faster, sleeker, and looked like the future of British armour. Designed to outrun and outmaneuver its enemies, it embodied Britain's faith in engineering finesse, speed, precision, and elegance over brute simplicity. The Sherman was the opposite, boxy, unglamorous, a machine built by people who valued reliability above perfection. One tank promised brilliance, the other promised consistency. Only one would deliver. Observers noted the irony from the very beginning. Britain, the nation that had invented the tank during World War I, was now struggling to build one that could even finish a long road march. Mechanics followed behind the columns like nurses in a field hospital, tending to overheating engines, jammed gearboxes, and leaking seals. Each time a Cromwell stopped, it wasn't just a vehicle out of action, it disrupted the entire formation. Supply trucks waited. Fuel convoys stalled. Crews went hungry, missing sleep and losing morale. One broken tank slowed dozens of men. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, the campfires told the same story. Sherman crews rested early, laughing and writing letters home. Cromwell crews stayed up late, covered in grease, wrenching under dim lanterns. What looked like a small inconvenience on a spreadsheet, a few more hours of maintenance, translated into exhaustion and frustration across an entire unit. Reliability wasn't just a mechanical trait, it was the difference between confidence and constant worry. Yet on paper, the Cromwell was supposed to win. It was the fastest tank in Europe, capable of reaching 40 miles per hour, a full 10 miles faster than the Sherman. Its low profile made it hard to spot on the battlefield. Its Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, adapted from an aircraft power plant, was a masterpiece of British engineering. The designers had imagined a perfect blend of speed and strength, a tank that could race across open terrain and strike before the enemy could react. The theory was flawless. But theory doesn't tighten bolts or change gear oil. As Exercise Dracula progressed, small problems became chronic ones. Oil leaked from seals that weren't designed for the jolting, uneven stress of tank warfare. The cooling systems, meant for high-altitude aircraft, struggled to manage heat in the confined, dust-choked armor hull. Gears slipped, brakes overheated, and clutches burned out under pressure. Engineers had predicted none of it because they'd tested the Cromwell in laboratories, not on roads. The Sherman, by contrast, had been designed for the battlefield, not the blueprint. Its creators accepted its limitations from the start. It wasn't the fastest, strongest, or most advanced, but it worked every single day. Simple, rugged components that could be replaced in the field. Engines built from proven car parts. A transmission that any mechanic could understand. It was a tank built not by perfectionists, but by pragmatists. By the first 1,000 miles, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Cromwells arrived late at every checkpoint. Some limped in, sputtering with temporary fixes. Others had to be towed. Meanwhile, the Shermans, dependable as clockwork, finished their routes and waited, engines purring quietly in the fading light. The British officers watching from their jeeps didn't need the data tables to understand what they were seeing. They were witnessing a slow-motion disaster unfolding mile by mile. Among those keeping detailed notes was Major General Richardson, the commander of the exercise. Each night he wrote reports that grew sharper in tone. What began as mild concerns soon turned to disbelief. He wrote that the supposed fastest tank in the world was being outpaced by machines that looked, in his words, as if designed by carpenters rather than engineers. His frustration was shared by every British mechanic watching their machines fail under conditions that should have been ideal. The Americans, polite as ever, didn't comment openly. They didn't need to. Their tanks spoke for themselves. The Sherman didn't boast. It just moved forward, mile after mile, hour after hour, day after day, without complaint. By early September, the experiment had crossed nearly the full 2,000 miles, and the data was ready. What the numbers revealed was more devastating than anyone expected. Every fault, every minute of repair time, every adjustment had been logged with precision. When analysts compiled it all into tables and charts, the conclusion was unmistakable and deeply embarrassing for Britain's armoured program. Across the entire test, the American Shermans covered nearly 14,000 miles combined. They logged just under 200 mechanical issues, none of which required major overhauls. The total repair time, 420 hours. Spread across 3 tanks, that worked out to a fraction of an hour per mile, roughly 2 minutes of maintenance for every mile driven. For a machine weighing over 30 tons, built for war, it was astonishing. The Sherman wasn't just reliable, it was nearly maintenance-free by military standards. The crews joked that the biggest problem they faced was finding something to fix. Then came the British numbers. The 5 Cromwell tanks covered fewer miles, around 11,500 combined, but recorded 367 faults, twice as many issues while driving less distance. Their mechanics spent 814 hours on repairs. In cold mathematical terms, that meant the Cromwell needed more than double the maintenance time per mile compared to the Sherman. Every mile in a Cromwell demanded 4 minutes of work instead of 2. It sounded small on paper. In reality, it was the difference between moving forward and standing still. The Centaur tanks, the Cromwell's close cousin, performed worst of all. They broke down so often that some had to be left behind entirely. Leaking oil, seizing engines, and failing transmissions plagued them from start to finish. Their Liberty engines, relics of the interwar years, simply weren't built to handle the demands of modern warfare. Engineers had long suspected the design was a mistake, but now they had proof in black and white. The Centaur wasn't just inefficient, it was a liability. When Major General Richardson presented his final report, he didn't sugarcoat it. The simplicity and reliability of the American machines, he wrote, is to me the chief lesson of this exercise. His tone was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Britain's engineering pride had been humbled. The Cromwell might have been fast and elegant, but the Sherman was the one that actually worked. In war, that mattered more than beauty or speed. The implications went far beyond one set of tanks. British leadership had poured enormous resources into tank design, believing that sophistication and high performance were the keys to victory. But this test showed that all the brilliance in the world meant nothing if the tanks couldn't keep moving. Reliability wasn't glamorous, but it won battles. A tank that broke down before reaching the front line might as well not exist at all. To make matters worse, Exercise Dracula had been conducted under near-perfect conditions. Crews had daylight for repairs, clean water, good roads, and full maintenance support every evening. These were luxuries no real battlefield could offer. Even so, the Cromwells barely managed to stay running. In actual combat, mud, dust, darkness, and enemy fire, their performance would only deteriorate further. As one observer dryly noted, "If this is how they perform on parade, I dare not imagine how they'll fare in war." Back in London, the results sent shockwaves through the War Office. Engineers pored over the data, searching for explanations. They found plenty. The Meteor engine that powered the Cromwell, while powerful, had been adapted from an aircraft design that was never meant for tank use. Aircraft engines ran at steady speeds and enjoyed constant cooling airflow. Tank engines did the opposite: stop, start, climb, brake, idle, rev, all in tight, enclosed compartments full of heat. The result was predictable: oil leaks, cooling failures, and mechanical stress beyond design limits. The transmission was another weak link. The Merritt-Brown gearbox, though advanced, was complex and fragile. It offered excellent control and maneuverability when it worked, but it often didn't. The brakes overheated under prolonged use. The clutch slipped under the Meteor's torque. And the suspension, a carryover from older cruiser tanks, simply wasn't designed for the heavier, faster Cromwell. Each system might have been acceptable in isolation, but together they created a machine that constantly fought itself. In contrast, the Sherman's components were almost boringly simple, and that was its genius. Its radial engine was dependable and easy to maintain. The transmission was straightforward, the suspension rugged and forgiving. Everything about it was built with the field in mind, not the drawing board. When something broke, it could be fixed quickly, often by the crew itself. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. Soldiers trusted it, and that trust was priceless. As the report circulated among senior officers, an uncomfortable truth emerged. Britain's engineering culture itself was part of the problem. For decades, British designers had prized technical sophistication, elegant solutions, and cutting-edge performance. American engineers, by contrast, aimed for practicality, good enough machines that could be mass-produced, maintained by ordinary soldiers, and keep working under abuse. The results spoke for themselves. The embarrassment was compounded by the fact that the Americans hadn't even treated the test as a competition. They were simply verifying performance data for their tanks. Britain, however, had approached it as a matter of national pride, a chance to prove that its machines were equal or superior to American designs. Instead, the test revealed that the nation that invented the tank had fallen behind in building one that could actually last. Behind closed doors, British engineers and officers began discussing how to fix the situation. But first, they had to confront a painful question. How had this happened at all? How had decades of engineering excellence produced a tank that couldn't drive 2,000 miles without breaking down, while America's mass-produced ugly duckling could roll the same distance with barely a complaint? The answers were not hidden in any single flaw, but scattered across the entire design philosophy of Britain's tank industry. It wasn't that the Cromwell was poorly built, it was brilliantly built for the wrong kind of war. Britain's tank doctrine had always emphasized speed and agility. Tanks, in British thinking, were not supposed to grind forward like American ones. They were meant to dance, swift reconnaissance machines that could dash ahead, flank, and withdraw before the enemy could react. But war had changed, and Britain's doctrine hadn't changed fast enough. When the Meteor engine was first adapted from the Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft power plant, it seemed like genius. The same engine that powered Spitfires would now drive Britain's most advanced tank. The idea sounded patriotic, elegant, and efficient, until engineers realized that what worked at 10,000 feet didn't work in the mud of Normandy. Aircraft engines enjoyed steady airflow, smooth conditions, and uniform speeds. Tanks lived in chaos, abrupt braking, heavy impacts, constant torque reversals, dust clogging every crevice. The Meteor was magnificent in theory, but fragile in practice. Oil seals designed for flight leaked under ground pressure. Cooling systems struggled in the tight armor hull. It was a masterpiece built for the wrong battlefield. The gearbox told a similar story. The Merritt-Brown transmission was technically impressive, smooth, flexible, offering excellent control over steering and speed. But it was intricate, full of finely tuned parts that needed constant attention. American tanks, by contrast, used robust transmissions that were easy to service even in the field. A Sherman's gearbox could be replaced in a few hours with standard tools. A Cromwell's needed a team of fitters, cranes, and days of work. In war, time mattered more than elegance. Then there was the suspension. Designed for earlier cruiser tanks that were lighter and slower, it simply couldn't handle the Cromwell's increased speed and weight. Springs snapped, bogies wore down, wheels bent under stress. It wasn't catastrophic, it was worse than that. It was constant. Every few hours, something small went wrong. Not enough to halt operations, but enough to drain energy, manpower, and morale. The Cromwell was a machine that demanded to be loved and maintained constantly, while the Sherman just asked to be used. By the end of the test, Major General Richardson understood that these weren't just mechanical problems, they were philosophical ones. He wrote that British engineering had built a racing car when what was required was a farm tractor. The Americans, he noted, had focused on what mattered most, a machine that could keep moving. The Sherman didn't impress engineers, it impressed soldiers. When crews climbed into it, they trusted it to bring them home. That trust wasn't accidental. The Sherman had been designed from the ground up with soldiers in mind. Its parts were standardized, interchangeable, and mass-produced. Every component had been tested under rough conditions. The designers didn't chase perfection, they chased dependability. And they achieved it. The tank could be repaired anywhere, often by its own crew using spare parts from other vehicles. Its systems were intuitive. Even the smallest details, like wide tracks that reduced ground pressure and rubber pads that quieted movement, made life easier for those who depended on it. The Cromwell's failures, ironically, reflected Britain's greatest strengths. The country had always valued craftsmanship, precision, and performance. Its engineers built machines that were marvels of complexity. Aircraft, ships, and engines admired the world over. But those same instincts became weaknesses in total war. The world's best-built sports car was still useless if it couldn't run after a few hundred miles. America's philosophy was humbler but wiser. Build it simple, build it strong, and build a lot of them. In the weeks after Exercise Dracula, secret meetings were held across the British tank industry. Rolls-Royce engineers examined the Meteor's reliability issues and began redesigning the oil seals and cooling systems. Leland Motors worked on reinforcing the clutch and transmission components. The brakes were enlarged and strengthened to handle the tank's speed and weight. Every subsystem received attention, and every fix revealed new challenges. It was progress, but slow progress. Meanwhile, American factories kept producing Shermans by the thousands. By early 1944, the Cromwell had improved significantly, but the damage to Britain's reputation was already done. In the eyes of its own soldiers, the Sherman had become the symbol of trust. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Cromwell crews, by contrast, knew that their tanks demanded patience and constant care. They admired its speed and low silhouette but dreaded its unpredictability. Reliability wasn't something you could retrofit in a few months. It had to be designed from the beginning. And yet, despite all the frustration, British engineers refused to give up. They knew that the Cromwell could be better, that buried inside its problems was potential waiting to be unlocked. The Battle Cromwell project was launched to correct every major flaw. Stronger parts, better seals, improved airflow. The goal was to make a British tank that could finally rival the Sherman not in theory, but in endurance. It was a noble effort, born from humiliation and pride. But as these fixes rolled out, one reality became impossible to ignore: time. War didn't wait for perfection. While Britain reworked its designs, the Sherman was already winning wars across continents. It was crossing deserts, jungles, and mountains, and doing it all without falling apart. By the time the improved Cromwells were ready for service, the Sherman had already written its legend. In the spring of 1944, as preparations for the Normandy invasion intensified, the contrast between the two tanks was more evident than ever. On the massive training grounds of southern England, rows of Shermans and Cromwells stood side by side, one representing quantity, the other quality. Yet soldiers who worked with them daily knew which one truly earned their confidence. The Cromwell might have been sleek and fast, but the Sherman felt dependable, almost friendly. It was a machine that forgave mistakes. British commanders had to make a difficult choice. The Sherman would form the backbone of most Allied armoured divisions, while the Cromwell would serve in specific roles where its speed might offer an advantage. For many officers, this decision was pragmatic. For British engineers, it was painful. After all, this was the country that had invented the tank. To rely on an American design, mass-produced and considered inferior on paper, was a quiet humiliation that no official report would ever state openly. Still, the Cromwell had one undeniable advantage: speed. On open ground, it could outpace nearly any tank in the world. It was agile, fast to respond, and incredibly smooth at high velocity. In reconnaissance roles and fast assaults, it shone brilliantly. Tank crews describe it as driving a steel sports car, a thrill that few other machines could offer. During maneuvers, Cromwells could dart across fields and flank mock enemies before they could react. If reliability could be improved, it might yet become a legend. But the war had no patience for if. D-Day arrived in June 1944, and the Shermans led the way. Thousands of them rolled onto the beaches of Normandy, part of the largest armoured force ever assembled. Their performance wasn't flawless, but it was consistent. They kept moving, kept fighting, kept pushing inland. The Cromwells followed later, assigned to reconnaissance units and supporting roles. When they reached the front, their speed became both their weapon and their curse. The narrow hedgerows of France were a nightmare for fast tanks. Cromwells, designed for open terrain, struggled to maneuver through dense countryside. Their engines overheated in the summer heat. Mechanics worked overtime, patching coolant leaks and fixing jammed gearboxes. Meanwhile, Sherman crews advanced steadily, using their tanks as mobile fortresses rather than racing machines. The Americans had turned reliability into strategy. Yet there were moments when the Cromwell's design paid off spectacularly. During the breakout from Normandy, when open fields replaced hedgerows, the British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, unleashed their Cromwells in sweeping flanking manoeuvres. Moving at speeds that astonished observers, they struck deep behind German lines, outpacing infantry and cutting supply routes. German reports described fast-moving British tanks appearing where no tanks should be. For a brief moment, the Cromwell fulfilled its destiny, the perfect strike weapon for open warfare. But those moments were fleeting. Every burst of brilliance came at a mechanical cost. After long marches, the familiar issues returned: leaks, overheating, worn clutches. The Cromwell was like a thoroughbred, magnificent when sprinting, but fragile when forced to run too long. The Sherman, the steady workhorse, just kept going. By the time the Allies reached Belgium, the statistics spoke for themselves again. For every Sherman that needed serious repair, 2 Cromwells did. It wasn't that the British didn't learn, they learned fast. Engineers in field workshops began improvising solutions. They added extra filters, modified the cooling systems, and replaced failing parts with locally fabricated versions. The Cromwell improved through sheer necessity, shaped by the hands of soldiers rather than the plans of designers. Each one became slightly different, customized by its crew to survive the campaign. Some even outperformed their American counterparts after enough adjustments. But the underlying issue remained: too complex, too delicate for a global war fought in mud, dust, and chaos. Still, soldiers loved the Cromwell spirit. They admired its responsiveness, its sense of control. When everything worked, it felt alive, a machine that answered instantly, like it shared the crew's intentions. It was fast, maneuverable, and quiet compared to the Sherman's roar. Tank commanders valued that in reconnaissance and surprise attacks. One officer described it best: the Sherman gets you there, the Cromwell makes it thrilling. As 1944 turned to 1945, the war's focus shifted toward Germany. The Allies were now advancing through devastated cities and ruined countryside. In these closing months, every mechanical weakness became amplified. Roads were cratered, bridges blown apart, fuel scarce. A tank that needed constant maintenance became a liability. Cromwell crews often found themselves scavenging for parts from wrecked vehicles. Sherman crews simply swapped components, confident that replacements were always available. Standardization was America's invisible weapon. Behind the front lines, British engineers were already thinking ahead. They had taken the lessons of the Cromwell, both its brilliance and its flaws, and begun designing something new: a tank that combined speed, firepower, and reliability. It would take the spirit of the Cromwell and ground it in American-style practicality. That project would become the Comet, the Cromwell's successor and, in many ways, its redemption. But before that redemption could arrive, the Cromwell had one more chapter to write. In the final battles of 1945, it would prove that, despite everything, it still had fight left in it. It wasn't the perfect tank, far from it, but in the right hands, with the right crew, it could still change the course of a battle. And in the desperate push across the Rhine, it would do exactly that. March 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its final act. The Allies had broken through Germany's western defences and were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before the heart of the Reich. This was the moment every tank crew had trained for: open country ahead, the enemy on the run, and the chance to end the war once and for all. Among the thousands of vehicles assembling along the riverbanks were dozens of Cromwells from the British 11th Armoured Division. Their crews had mixed feelings, proud of their machines, but painfully aware of their limits. Every man in a Cromwell knew its quirks: the engine that needed gentle handling, the gearbox that preferred coaxing to force, and the brakes that faded if pushed too long. Yet they also knew something else: when a Cromwell was running right, nothing on wheels could catch it. On March 24th, under cover of darkness, the Great Allied Crossing began. American forces surged over the Rhine first, followed by British and Canadian units. Once the engineers built pontoon bridges sturdy enough to bear the weight of tanks, the armoured columns began to roll east. The Cromwells came roaring across the temporary bridgeheads, their engines echoing over the river. It was the moment of truth for Britain's speed machines. As the Cromwells poured into the German countryside, they finally found the terrain they were made for: long roads, open fields, and clear skies. The fast reconnaissance regiments of the British Army surged ahead, scouting towns before the main Sherman formations could arrive. For a few electrifying weeks, the Cromwell regained its glory. It moved with an energy and grace that stunned onlookers, the kind of movement that reminded everyone why British designers had loved this machine in the first place. In one such advance, near the city of Munster, a squadron of Cromwells covered over 60 miles in a single day, a record for British tanks in Germany. They darted through villages, crossed rivers, and pursued retreating German columns. Locals, watching the tanks thunder past, later described the scene as a steel wind sweeping through the fields. That day, every man in the 11th Armoured Division forgot about oil leaks and mechanical quirks. For that day, the Cromwell was unstoppable. But speed had its price. By nightfall, nearly a third of the tanks required repairs. Some had lost road wheels, others were leaking coolant. The mechanics worked by lamplight, tightening bolts, replacing hoses, patching anything they could. It was the familiar rhythm of life in a Cromwell unit, glory followed by grease and exhaustion. The next morning, most of them were running again. The crews didn't complain. They had long accepted that their tanks needed more love than others. And somehow, that made them prouder of them. In the final weeks of the war, the Cromwell became a symbol of resilience, imperfect but determined. It wasn't the most efficient tank, nor the most reliable, but it was fast, fierce, and deeply British. It represented the spirit of adaptation, the willingness to keep going even when the odds, or the machines, weren't in your favour. When victory finally came in May 1945, the Cromwells that had survived the campaign were lined up in neat rows at captured airfields across northern Germany. Many bore scars from the road, dents, cracked fenders, and paint scorched from overworked engines. But they had made it. Some crews painted small inscriptions on the armour, "Made in Britain, survived in Europe." It was half joke, half triumph. After the fighting stopped, the British Army began collecting data from all its tank units. The reports confirmed what everyone already knew. The Cromwell had performed admirably in short bursts but required constant mechanical attention. The Sherman, by contrast, had marched across half of Europe with minimal breakdowns. The difference was more than technical. It was strategic. While the Sherman divisions advanced effortlessly, the British armoured regiments had to pause more often, waiting for repairs or spare parts. Even a few hours of delay, multiplied across hundreds of vehicles, meant lost opportunities. Yet one statistic stood out. Despite its maintenance demands, the Cromwell had one of the lowest loss rates in British service. Crews credited its speed and low profile for keeping them safe. It could dart in and out of danger faster than most German tanks could aim. In tank warfare, survivability wasn't just about armour thickness, it was about movement. The Cromwell might not endure a direct hit as well as a Sherman, but it could avoid being hit in the first place. That agility saved lives. For many soldiers, that mattered more than any engineering report. They remembered the thrill of cutting across a field at 50 kilometers per hour, the engine roaring, the tracks throwing mud behind them, the wind whipping through the open hatches. They remembered how alive the tank felt, how it became an extension of their will. When it worked, it wasn't just a machine, it was a teammate. Back in Britain, engineers at the Department of Tank Design were already at work on the Cromwell successor. The lessons were clear: keep the speed, simplify the mechanics, strengthen the reliability. The result would be the Comet, a tank that fixed nearly everything its predecessor had done wrong. It had a more powerful gun, improved armour, and most importantly, a refined version of the Meteor engine that finally matched performance with endurance. It was, in many ways, what the Cromwell had always wanted to be, a tank worthy of Britain's ambitions and America's pragmatism. But history would remember the Cromwell differently. It wasn't the perfect machine, nor the dominant one. It was something rarer, a tank that embodied a transition. The moment when Britain learned, through hard experience, that even brilliance must bow to practicality. The Cromwell's legacy wasn't its victories or its numbers. It was the lesson it forced a nation to learn, that war rewards what works, not what dazzles. And that lesson would shape every British tank that followed, from the Comet to the Centurion and beyond. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the world began to take stock of what had actually won the war. The headlines spoke of bravery, strategy, and leadership, but for those who had lived inside the machines, victory often came down to one word: reliability. It was the difference between tanks that could keep advancing and those that spent half their lives under repair tarps. In this quiet reckoning, the Cromwell became a case study in both failure and growth. British engineers were candid in their post-war assessments. The Cromwell's mechanical issues were not a mystery. They were the result of rushed wartime development and industrial limits. Britain's factories had been bombed, resources stretched thin, and designs constantly modified mid-production. Each change, however small, created new complications. Some Cromwells had slightly different transmissions, others used alternate cooling systems, and spare parts weren't always interchangeable. What began as innovation turned into chaos for the mechanics trying to keep them alive on the battlefield. The Americans had taken a completely different path. Their Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines like automobiles, identical down to the smallest bolt. A mechanic trained in Detroit could service one in France without hesitation. The parts were universal, the systems intuitive. Crews could swap entire engines or turrets within hours. The result wasn't glamorous, but it was unstoppable. When one broke down, another took its place. And when both broke, the repair trucks behind them had everything they needed to make them run again by morning. This difference went far beyond manufacturing. It reflected two entire cultures of engineering. Britain still believed in craftsmanship. America believed in production. The British built machines that demanded skill. The Americans built machines that demanded use. And in a world war, usable always beat beautiful. Still, to dismiss the Cromwell as a failure would be unfair. It was fast, well-armed for its class, and far ahead of its time in maneuverability. Its low silhouette made it a difficult target, and its speed allowed daring raids that slower tanks could never attempt. It found its niche not as a frontline brawler, but as a reconnaissance and exploitation vehicle, a role where it could use its agility to outthink and outrun the enemy rather than outfight him. The 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, used Cromwells with deadly efficiency during the dash across northern Germany. Their commanders often described them as scalpel tanks, sharp, precise, and meant to strike quickly. After the war, this versatility kept the Cromwell in service long past what anyone expected. Britain, still recovering economically, couldn't replace every tank overnight. The Cromwell was therefore upgraded, modernized, and repurposed. In Korea, it rolled again, this time across frozen hills instead of muddy fields. Against the backdrop of new jet aircraft and atomic weapons, the Cromwell looked like a relic, yet it still performed reliably enough to serve alongside newer Centurions. Other nations adopted it too. Finland, Austria, Israel, and even Jordan received Cromwells through British aid programs. In Israel, many were converted into armored recovery vehicles or command tanks. Some were even refitted into new designs, like the Charioteer, a tank destroyer with a high-velocity 20-pounder gun, extending the Cromwell's usefulness into the 1950s. It was a remarkable second life for a machine once dismissed as unreliable. The fixes made after Exercise Dracula, stronger seals, better brakes, improved clutches, had turned it into something dependable. Not perfect, but dependable enough. For a tank that had once embarrassed its creators, that was redemption in steel. Yet, the broader lesson of the Cromwell went far beyond its own story. It changed how Britain thought about war machines altogether. Engineers realized that performance on paper meant nothing if the machine couldn't survive the realities of mud, heat, and exhaustion. Tank design had to begin not in theory, but in the dirt. Reliability was not a luxury feature, it was the core of survival. This realization shaped the next generation. The Comet, introduced in the war's final months, was built on Cromwell's foundation but stripped of its excess complexity. It had a refined version of the Meteor engine, a smoother transmission, and most importantly, lessons learned from every failure that came before. Crews who transitioned from Cromwell to Comet called it a relief in armor form. It moved confidently, felt stable, and required less maintenance. Britain had finally built a tank that could rival the Sherman in endurance and surpass it in firepower. But even that wasn't the end of the story. The Comet's success paved the way for something greater, the Centurion, widely regarded as one of the best tanks ever made. It would dominate post-war battlefields, blending firepower, protection, and reliability into a near-perfect balance. In every bolt of the Centurion, there was a trace of the Cromwell, not as a failure, but as the teacher that had shown British engineers what truly mattered. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Sherman's legend only grew. It became the tank that symbolized Allied victory. It fought in Korea, in the Middle East, and even in South America decades later. Its mechanical simplicity and dependability made it adaptable to endless upgrades. Some Shermans fought as late as the 1970s, an almost unbelievable lifespan for a World War II vehicle. That contrast, the Sherman's endurance and the Cromwell struggle, would haunt British industry for years. Every new project carried the same question: would it work when it mattered? Engineers could no longer afford to chase elegance at the expense of function. In that sense, the Cromwell wasn't just a tank, it was a turning point in philosophy. It had shown that in war, a brilliant idea means nothing if it breaks halfway to the battlefield. And that truth, learned painfully on the roads of Normandy, would echo through every British design that followed. By the late 1940s, Britain's tank designers had accepted a hard truth. The war had humbled them. The Cromwell had not been a disaster, but it had proven that brilliance in the workshop meant little if it didn't translate to endurance in the field. The Americans had built a tank that might have looked unremarkable, even clumsy, yet it had carried an army across continents. The Sherman didn't win through glamour. It won through reliability, logistics, and timing. And the lessons of that contrast would shape the coming era of armored warfare. Inside the War Office, reports from Exercise Dracula and post-war evaluations were studied with almost forensic attention. One of the clearest findings was philosophical rather than mechanical. Britain had pursued excellence. America had pursued usability. The difference was subtle, but the results were not. The Cromwell was faster, lighter, and theoretically more advanced, yet the Sherman simply worked better. 4 soldiers under fire, that was all that mattered. The British engineering establishment began to change its mindset. Gone was the obsession with perfection at any cost. In its place came an emphasis on durability, simplicity, and maintainability. Designs were to be tested under realistic conditions: mud, dust, rain, exhaustion, not just on clean proving grounds. This shift marked a quiet revolution. The same nation that had once built temperamental sports cars was now learning to think like Detroit. The results came quickly. The Comet, born directly from Cromwell's lessons, impressed crews across Europe. It was smoother, more stable, and far easier to maintain. It could keep pace with advancing infantry and hold its own against late-war German tanks. In many ways, it was the tank the Cromwell had always wanted to be: fast, reliable, and deadly. But even the Comet's success couldn't erase the shadow of the war's earlier embarrassment. For years, British officers would half-joke, "We design tanks for museums. The Americans design tanks for war." That joke hid a deeper anxiety. During the war, British factories had been pushed to their limits. Producing ships, planes, and weapons for a global conflict left little room for the kind of industrial scale the United States had achieved. American assembly lines could build 1,000 tanks in the time it took Britain to finish a few hundred. And while British tanks were built with care, that care meant complexity, and complexity meant breakdowns. The Cromwell had been born in that contradiction, a product of genius trapped in the limitations of its time. For tank crews, those limitations had faces, names, and sleepless nights. Mechanics remembered entire evenings spent coaxing the Meteor engine back to life after a long march. Drivers developed rituals, tapping the clutch pedal twice before shifting, easing the throttle gently uphill, superstitions that kept their tanks running. The relationship between crew and machine was intimate, almost personal. Every Cromwell had its quirks, its moods, its personality. Some crews loved theirs. Others cursed it daily. But every one of them respected it, because despite everything, it kept fighting. In conversations recorded after the war, veterans often spoke fondly of the Cromwell, even while acknowledging its flaws. It was a temperamental friend, one driver recalled. You had to know how to handle it. Treat it wrong and it'd quit on you, but treat it right and it would fly. Another described it as a wild horse, beautiful, fast, and likely to throw you if you weren't careful. That affection was genuine. The tank had character, something the reliable but unexciting Sherman rarely inspired. Historians later noted that this difference in perception revealed much about the two nations' wartime cultures. The American soldier valued predictability, a tank that always started, that could be repaired with a wrench and a spare part from another machine. The British soldier, steeped in a tradition of improvisation, valued adaptability, the ability to make things work even when conditions fell apart. The Cromwell demanded that spirit, and the British crews gave it willingly. But in the cold arithmetic of war, reliability was still the decisive factor. An army's pace wasn't set by its fastest tank, but by its slowest, or, more precisely, by the one that broke down first. Every hour spent fixing a gearbox was an hour lost advancing, and the Allies' success in 1944-45 had depended entirely on relentless momentum. In that light, the Sherman's boring consistency became a weapon in itself. Even so, the Cromwell left an enduring mark on British design. Its low profile influenced future tanks for decades. Its Meteor engine, once temperamental, evolved into one of the most successful tank power plants in history, powering not just the Comet but the Centurion, a machine that would define post-war British armour. And while the Cromwell's record could never rival the Sherman's, it had paved the way for a generation of tanks that finally achieved what it could not: true reliability in motion. By the time the 1950s arrived, the Cromwell's reputation had softened. What had once been a symbol of frustration had become a nostalgic artifact, a reminder of the transition from improvisation to industrial efficiency. Many were displayed in training grounds, museums, or even local memorials, their green paint polished, their flaws forgotten. To the public, they looked like heroes of the road to victory. And in a sense, they were. Because without the Cromwell's failure, Britain might never have learned what the Sherman had proven so convincingly: that the best tank isn't the one that looks the best, or even fights the best, but the one that keeps fighting when the battle stretches on and the machines begin to fail. The Cromwell may not have won the war, but it changed how Britain built for the wars that followed. Its lessons lived on, in steel, in doctrine, and in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important victories happen not in combat, but in the factory, the blueprint, and the engineer's mind. As Britain entered the post-war years, a new reality began to set in. Wars were no longer won only on the battlefield, but in the assembly lines and design offices. The Cromwell had proven that heroism couldn't compensate for mechanical failure, and that lessons written in grease and frustration could shape entire generations of machines to come. What had once been an embarrassment was now a milestone, the point where British tank philosophy began to change direction forever. In the early 1950s, the Ministry of Supply initiated a series of comprehensive studies comparing wartime production methods. These reports didn't just look at what had worked, but why it worked. The Americans, the data revealed, had succeeded because their industry was built for volume and consistency. Their designs sacrificed elegance for practicality, their tolerances were looser, and their focus was always on good enough, every time. The British approach, though proud and precise, had produced excellence in small numbers, a luxury that total war simply didn't allow. The engineers who studied these findings realized that the Cromwell had failed not because it was badly designed, but because it was designed in the wrong context. It was a tank built for a nation that still believed in craftsmanship, in the idea that each machine should be the product of careful attention rather than efficient replication. In peace, that philosophy created masterpieces. In war, it created bottlenecks. Thus began Britain's gradual pivot toward what they called the American principle: standardization. The new generation of British tanks would be designed not for ideal conditions, but for the messy, unpredictable chaos of real battlefields. Components would be interchangeable. Field repairs would be simple. Training manuals would emphasize ease of operation rather than technical finesse. Every decision flowed from one truth learned at terrible cost: the tank that keeps moving wins. At the same time, across the Atlantic, American engineers were refining the Sherman's legacy into a new family of post-war tanks. The lessons of mass production were now being fused with improved armor, firepower, and mobility. It was as though the two nations were converging toward a shared understanding, each having learned from the other. Britain was adopting American pragmatism, while America was absorbing some of Britain's precision. The age of the perfect machine had ended. The age of the reliable weapon had begun. But even as new designs rolled off production lines, the Cromwell lingered. In smaller armies across Europe and the Middle East, it remained in service, painted in fresh camouflage, sometimes with upgraded radios or local modifications. Its silhouette became a familiar sight in military parades from Vienna to Tel Aviv. It was no longer the star of the show, but it refused to disappear. Like a seasoned veteran, it carried on, doing its duty long after the world had moved on to sleeker designs. In Israel, the Cromwell's second life became almost legendary. With resources scarce and enemies on every border, the young Israeli Defense Force made the most of what it had. British Cromwells, renamed and reconfigured, were used in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, often alongside or against Sherman tanks. Crews found the Cromwell's speed invaluable for hit-and-run tactics in open desert terrain. Mechanics, familiar with its quirks, joke that it leaks oil, but it gets there. In those years, the Cromwell became less a relic and more a symbol of resilience, proof that even imperfect machines can earn greatness through persistence. Meanwhile, in Britain, tank designers were already looking beyond the Comet to a new concept, one that would combine all the best qualities of its predecessors. This vision became the Centurion, first entering service in the late 1940s. Unlike the Cromwell, it was designed not to chase theoretical speed records, but to dominate the battlefield through balance. It had thick armor, a powerful gun, and, crucially, a mechanical simplicity that crews trusted. Historians later called it the first true main battle tank, a category that would define armored warfare for decades. And the DNA of the Centurion could be traced directly back to the lessons learned from the Cromwell struggles. Engineers would even admit this openly. One report from the Royal Armament Research Department noted, "The Cromwell's deficiencies were the foundation of our progress. Each weakness revealed an essential truth about the conditions under which tanks must actually fight." That statement summed up what no amount of post-war propaganda could hide, that progress was born not from success, but from mistakes endured and understood. The Cromwell had shown that perfection on paper was worthless without reliability on the ground. It had taught Britain's engineers humility, and from that humility came strength. The same nation that had once prioritized complexity would now pursue balance and endurance. The age of temperamental brilliance was over. Still, among soldiers and historians alike, debates continued. Some insisted that the Cromwell had been unfairly judged, that under true combat pressure, its speed and agility could have made a decisive difference if deployed differently. Others countered that its mechanical fragility would always have held it back, no matter how cleverly it was used. Both sides, however, agreed on one thing: the Cromwell had personality. It was a machine with spirit, ambition, and flaws, and that made it unforgettable. Even today, when preserved Cromwells rumble to life in museums or reenactments, spectators often describe the sound as alive. The deep, uneven rumble of the meteor engine, the metallic clatter of its suspension, it feels less like a machine starting up and more like something awakening from history. In that moment, the line between triumph and failure blurs. You're not just hearing a tank. You're hearing a lesson, still echoing across time. By the mid-1950s, the world had entered a new technological age, but the lessons of World War II still lingered like a shadow over every defense meeting and design table. Every tank blueprint, every industrial decision still carried the imprint of the Cromwell versus Sherman story, a quiet reminder that reliability wins wars, not promises on paper. In fact, British engineers often referred to that wartime comparison simply as the 2,000-mile lesson, a shorthand for what it truly took to make a machine trustworthy. The British Army's shift toward reliability wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Commanders who had once obsessed over horsepower and top speed were now asking simpler questions. Will it start tomorrow morning? Can it make the next 50 miles without a breakdown? The Cromwell had turned those questions into doctrine. Maintenance schedules became stricter. Crews were trained not just to fight but to care for their vehicles methodically. Armored warfare was no longer just about bravery and gunnery. It was about discipline, planning, and mechanical empathy. In this new era, the Cromwell story took on a different kind of meaning. It was studied at military academies not as a failure, but as a transitional design, the bridge between the old world of handcrafted machines and the modern reality of industrialized warfare. In lecture halls, instructors would point to its sleek silhouette and explain how beauty and efficiency don't always coexist. They would show photos of exercise Dracula's endless repair charts and use them to drive home the moral: a tank that doesn't reach the battlefield is just an expensive bunker. Interestingly, the Cromwell's reputation abroad was often kinder than at home. In Finland and Austria, where it served as a training tank, it was praised for its handling and mobility. In smaller armies, where combat conditions were less intense, its quirk seemed almost charming. Mechanics appreciated its straightforward layout, and drivers loved how quickly it could pick up speed. In many of these nations, the Cromwell became the first tank to teach generations of soldiers how to drive and command armored vehicles, an unlikely educational legacy for a machine once written off as troublesome. At home, British industry was transforming. The painful wartime experience had exposed the limits of its fragmented manufacturing system. The government began consolidating tank production under fewer, more standardized facilities. Companies like Leyland Motors and Vickers Armstrongs became pillars of a new, coordinated defense industry. Engineers started adopting American-style production principles, interchangeable components, tighter quality control, and unified testing procedures. The goal was simple: never again should a British tank need double the maintenance time of its American counterpart. These reforms bore fruit faster than anyone expected. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Centurion emerged, sleek, balanced, and astonishingly reliable. Soldiers who had fought in Cromwell's and Sherman's immediately noticed the difference. The Centurion didn't complain, didn't leak, didn't stall under stress. It simply worked. It could travel for hundreds of miles with minimal attention. In field reports, officers described it with quiet satisfaction. It behaves like a gentleman, strong, dependable, and without drama. That kind of praise would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. And yet, behind the success of the Centurion lay a very human story of redemption. Many of the same engineers who had once worked on the Cromwell went on to design its successors. They remembered the long nights of testing and the frustration of breakdowns during Exercise Dracula. They carried those memories like scars, not of failure, but of lessons earned the hard way. One veteran engineer, interviewed years later, put it simply, "The Cromwell taught us humility, and humility built the Centurion." Even outside of military circles, the Cromwell's influence rippled outward. It shaped how British industries approached post-war design in general. Aircraft, vehicles, and even household machines began to emphasize reliability and maintainability over cutting-edge innovation for its own sake. Wartime tank lessons had found their way into civilian philosophy. Engineers began to understand that progress was not about adding more, but about making what already existed better. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Sherman's legend grew almost mythic. American veterans remembered it fondly, not for its looks or its armor, but for its trustworthiness. It became the symbol of an army that moved relentlessly forward, mile after mile, without waiting for its machines to catch up. Some Shermans, incredibly, were still in service in South America, the Middle East, and Asia into the 1970s. Every mile they traveled was a living echo of Exercise Dracula's verdict. As for the Cromwell, it faded gracefully into history. Many were melted down or converted into specialized vehicles, but a handful survived, parked in museums, rusting quietly in old depots, or restored by enthusiasts who refused to let them disappear. When these machines are started today, their meteor engines still produce that deep, uneven rumble, a sound both proud and imperfect, much like the history they represent. Visitors often describe standing beside a running Cromwell as strangely moving. The noise is not just mechanical, it feels emotional, almost apologetic, as if the tank itself remembers. It's in those moments that the Cromwell's real legacy becomes clear. It wasn't a perfect design or a war-winning weapon, but it was a teacher, a machine that forced an entire nation to rethink how it built, fought, and believed. Every gear, every leak, every sleepless night it caused led to something better. In that sense, it fulfilled its purpose more profoundly than even its designers could have imagined. And as the Centurion and later British tanks rolled triumphantly into service, one could almost say the Cromwell was still there, hidden in the hum of their engines, in every bolt tightened just a little better, in every engineer who remembered what happens when you build for pride instead of endurance. Decades later, when historians revisited the story of the Cromwell, they no longer spoke of failure. They spoke of transformation. What had once been labelled a disappointment had, in hindsight, become the foundation for Britain's post-war armour dominance. The Cromwell had been flawed, yes, temperamental, complex, and demanding, but it had forced the British military and industry to evolve. Without it, the Centurion might never have existed, and without the Centurion, Britain's reputation for tank excellence might never have recovered. To understand its legacy, one must look not just at what it achieved, but at what it revealed. The Cromwell exposed the limits of an entire mindset, the old belief that craftsmanship and theoretical performance could substitute for rugged practicality. It showed that a war machine must be more than impressive. It must be dependable, repeatable, and simple enough for ordinary soldiers to trust with their lives. This was the quiet revolution it sparked, a shift from engineering as art to engineering as survival. Even in the years that followed, British tank crews remembered the Cromwell fondly. They spoke of it with a mix of affection and respect, the way one might remember a spirited horse that threw them once but taught them how to ride better. It had character, they said. It made you a better driver, a better mechanic, and a better soldier. Every squeak, every vibration, every unpredictable noise taught patience and adaptability. In that sense, it was the perfect teacher for an army that would soon face new kinds of challenges in an uncertain post-war world. By the 1960s, as sleek, new tanks like the Chieftain entered service, the Cromwell had become a relic, but a respected one. It appeared in military parades, in museums, and on film sets, often symbolizing Britain's resilience during the toughest years of the war. Children clambered onto its hulls at public exhibitions, unaware that the vehicle beneath their feet had once sparked a quiet revolution in engineering philosophy. For many of those children, that rumbling steel shape was their first glimpse into history, a reminder that progress is often born from imperfection. And as decades passed, the Cromwell found a new kind of immortality. Restorers brought surviving examples back to life with painstaking care, rebuilding them bolt by bolt. When these tanks are started today, the same sound that once echoed through the fields of Normandy fills the air again, that throaty meteor roar, uneven but proud. It's a voice from another time, carrying a message that still matters. Reliability, not brilliance, wins the long game. Military historians now place the Cromwell within a grander narrative, not as a competitor to the Sherman, but as its complement. Together, they represent two philosophies that shaped the outcome of the Second World War. The Sherman showed the power of industrial efficiency. The Cromwell showed the cost of neglecting it. The Sherman was the product of a nation that perfected manufacturing. The Cromwell was the product of a nation learning to adapt. Both were necessary, in their own way, to reach the balance that defined modern warfare. In a sense, the Cromwell story mirrors Britain's own journey during the 20th century. A country steeped in craftsmanship and tradition confronted by the demands of a mechanized age, forced to evolve, to modernize, and to redefine what excellence meant. The Cromwell marked the painful but necessary turning point where pride gave way to pragmatism. And that shift, though costly, ensured Britain would remain a technological power long after the war ended. It's fitting, then, that one of Major General Richardson's final remarks in the Exercise Dracula report, written back in 1943, still resonates decades later. A commander with Shermans can be confident. A commander with Cromwells must be hopeful. It was meant as a criticism at the time, but with hindsight, it reads differently. Hope, after all, is the seed of improvement. The Cromwell represented that hope, the hope that mistakes could become lessons, that effort could turn into progress, that even the flawed could find purpose. It may not have matched the Sherman mile for mile, but its journey was every bit as meaningful. Today, when one sees a restored Cromwell gliding across a field at a heritage show, its engine purring smoothly, it's easy to forget that it once symbolized failure. The truth is far more profound. The Cromwell taught success. It proved that the value of a machine isn't measured only by what it achieves, but by what it inspires. For every engineer who studied its shortcomings, for every mechanic who learned its moods, and for every crewman who trusted it anyway, the Cromwell remains a reminder that progress is rarely perfect. It's earned through trial, through error, and through perseverance. And perhaps that's the most fitting final verdict on the tank that tried to outrun the Sherman, and, in its own way, succeeded at something far greater. It didn't just change how Britain built tanks. It changed how Britain thought about them. The Cromwell may not have conquered 2,000 miles without breaking, but it conquered something far more enduring, the British fear of imperfection. And from that victory came the machines, and the mindset, that would define modern armoured warfare for generations.